got invited to a podcast, you don't know how to prepare, you don't know what the things are that you should be thinking about before going to a podcast. Well, in this episode, I'm going to cover exactly that. I'm going to give you 10 tips that are going to help you prepare for a podcast that you got invited to, and think about all the things that you should be thinking about before going to a podcast episode. These 10 tips are going to help you become the best guest that someone has had on their own podcast. Plus, I'm going to add a 11th, like a top secret best tip at the end that I think will gonna help you the most. So stick around, grab some coffee, grab some tea, and let's get right into it. If we're meeting for the first time, my name is Borna Z and I started this podcast in 2019. Since then I've been a guest on a number of podcasts, and each time I kind of prepared myself to be as best as I can, to leave the best first impression that I can, and of course to be invited over again and to bring the most value that I can to all the guests that are listening. And I want to be a great guest, and that's exactly what I expect from my guests coming to my podcast. So I'm going to give you the best tips that I have for preparing for a podcast, and some things that I think that people usually overlook or forget, and some of the things that I notice that professionals do every time before they go to another person's podcast, just to make it kind of a little bit more interesting and a little bit more fun. I compiled it into 10 steps. Well, it's basically 10 tips for you guys, so make sure to grab your coffee. This is Coffee and Tea with Borna Z. I got a lot of inspiration from other podcasts to start this, and I want to share my thoughts and ideas and values that I have. Today I'm sipping on Velo coffee. It's like a light coffee from Brazil. If you don't like too strong coffees, this might be a great pick for you guys. And let's get right into the tips, guys. I think that if you're preparing for a podcast, the first thing that you should do is actually you should prepare for the podcast. And by prepare, I mean take care of the little things. Take care of the things that might get in the way. So first of all, I'm gonna cover the basics. Get enough sleep, get enough rest, get enough food and drink, because if you're doing a longer podcast, especially like Joe Rogan podcasts that are 3 hours long, you get tired after those. And if you're hungry while you're interviewed or interviewing someone, that's just a distraction. You're just losing time, focus, and energy. So make sure that everything is said beforehand, that you had a good night's sleep, that you got rest, that you had enough food and water, that your throat is not sore. Also make sure that if you're recording at home, if you're not in a person's studio, that nothing will get in the way of your podcast. So turn off your phone, tell everybody in the house that you're doing a podcast, that you need like at least an hour of some free time. Make sure to close your windows so there's no noises from the traffic, which could kind of divert the audience from listening to you and kind of cause noises in the background. Nobody actually likes to listen to those, so make sure to get rid of that. Also make sure that there's enough light in the room. Everything looks better when there's good lighting around. If you're in the dark, the visuals will not be that good, and then people can't see you properly, so make sure you have that under control. Adding some extra lights if you have them. Turn on the camera light on your phone. If you don't have anything else, I have a tripod with some lights on, which help everything, but I can turn on some extra lights like now. Now you can clearly see the difference now, but you will see it a lot more later when it gets darker outside. That's when the effect is really felt. Some people record indoors and then they don't have any problems with the lighting because they close off the windows and everything. I have big windows here, so I'm very affected by light, so I turn on all the lights to make it look a little bit better. Second tip to be the best podcast guest ever is to research the podcast and research the podcaster. Now let me draw a clear line here between both of them, because I feel that even if you do research the podcast, that doesn't mean that you research the person interviewing you. A lot of people start a podcast and then they talk to 100 guests and nobody knows who they are. So if you take the time to research the person that's interviewing you, you will have a lot easier time communicating with them, because you can always return a question to them and ask them something where they might know something, and then that gets the whole conversation going, and it prevents you from maybe going into directions where the interviewer doesn't want you to go. Also, when you're talking about things, you might draw parallels to what the person who's interviewing you also knows. That kind of makes the whole conversation a lot easier. And when you're researching the podcast, try watching at least 3 episodes of the podcast so you kind of get the feel of how the person is doing it. Are they letting the guest talk all the way? Do they ask the questions at the beginning? Is it just a free-flowing conversation? Do they prepare questions in advance? Are the questions short, long form? Are they open-ended? Are they closed loop? Are there like a interviewer that likes to provoke you a little bit and try to drag things out of you? Or is it just a normal free-flowing? Like when you think of Joe Rogan, you probably think of like a really normal conversation where you sit down and talk to to a person next to a coffee or whiskey or whatever they're consuming, right? You want to watch at least 3 episodes just so you get the feel for how the podcast is flowing, and that will help you adapt more easily to how the format of the podcast is going. Also, a good thing is to ask the person beforehand, how should I prepare? Sometimes they will just tell you outright, look, you don't have to worry, or think about this, or this is the questions that I will ask you. On the On2Go podcast that I'm running, I usually keep a free-flowing conversation and send a few bullet points to the guest that I'm interviewing beforehand, and there's always one question that I ask at the end. It's how to find the gold in life, and that's always how I end the podcast, because I think that's a very important question, and that's kind of the whole point of the whole podcast, so that's why I always leave it at the end. That's kind of my format, how I'm doing it, but everybody will have a different style, different technique, and you basically want to know as much as you can about the podcast to make it easier on you so you're better prepared as a guest. Third tip on becoming the best podcast guest ever is think about what you want to say. Think about what impact do you want to have on the podcast and on everybody listening. Imagine that the whole world is listening to you. Do you just want to have a chit chat where you're just like free flowing about something, or do you have a message that you want to send to the audience? Is there a why behind your appearance? Is there something that you want to convey to the audience? And by that, I don't mean that you have to talk about something like selling a product or promoting your own things, although we will talk about that later, which is a great tip as well. But I think that you have to think about, is there a message that you want to say? Is there a why? Is there like a purpose that's behind you? I know that sometimes people keep it free-flowing and say the topic will be something general like success or how to make money or things like that, you know, where they give you free range to kind of talk about whatever you want. But try to think about, even if the topic is really, really open-ended, try to think of a few things that you want to say, a few topics that you want to cover, and maybe one bullet point that could summarize your whole conversation into like one word, like let's say persistence, you know, and then talk about that, or save it for later when usually you'll see podcasters will like to ask you at the end something as a cliffhanger to keep the audience interested until the very end, and maybe save it for them. But basically know what you're talking about, even if you're not an expert in it. If you've done the research that I mentioned in tip number 2 to research the podcast beforehand, and you know the topic that the person invited you over on the podcast that they want to talk about, spend some time reading articles, listening to other people, what they've talked about, just so you know kind of what things are going on, what's happening, because the audience will usually notice if you know something or if you don't. They will usually know if you're familiar with the topic, if you're an expert, or if you're just like throwing things out there, and they will feel it. Just like everybody that starts something, people kind of know that they're a beginner, just like I'm a beginner in this podcast right now. I'm still improvising, I'm still not the best, but I'm getting there. I'm practicing. Each one of these episodes is a practice, you know, and you want to, that's how you want to approach it. You're not the expert, you don't know everything, but you want to take every podcast episode, every sentence basically that you're saying as getting one step closer to being a better podcast guest, or a public speaker, or a salesperson, or whatever you want to be in your life. And the last point here is, imagine that people literally took to heart everything that you said. Every word that you said stuck with someone, and somebody acted upon what you were saying. How would it make you feel? Would you be happy with what you said? Are you okay with that? Would it kind of make you a little bit afraid or a little bit worried that somebody might do something stupid with it? Think about it. Words are powerful, and you should think about what you were going to say and how that might affect other people. So that's a great preparation. Think about how you would feel maybe if somebody told that to you, or if you heard it for the first time. A great thing to think about. Tip number 4 in becoming the best podcast guest is don't try to be funny. I think funny is something that you cannot force. It's something that you either are or that you kind of practice into, but forcing it out of you is really, really hard. And I feel just like in the last tip, people feel it. People kind of get the sense that this is a practice joke, this is not natural, this is forced. So I think that stand-up comedians have a really tough time becoming really, really good, and they take a big risk by stepping on the stage and basically risking being laughed at by everyone. If you're trying to do a joke or trying to be funny during a podcast just to be funny, just to kind of raise the podcast to a new level, I basically don't think it will work unless you're in the like a flow state where you're really, really having fun with the other person and that the jokes are just like flowing out of you. If you don't feel it, if you don't feel that the joke is like, oh, I feel I should say that, basically skip it. I definitely would. I would rather keep it on a conversational level or a serious level rather than risking being like trying to be funny. I think it just comes off bad because a lot of people listen to podcasts to get some value out of them. Unless it's a funny podcast where you literally want to be entertained, then try to do it from the start, but then try to put yourself in a more relaxed and funny state before you go. That's basically before you go on the stage, right? Every stand-up comedian does that. Every public speaker does that. They put themselves in a better state before they go onto the stage. So when they're on the stage, they're already prepared. They're already ready. Everything that they're saying is already flowing. If you don't feel the flow, just skip the jokes. Keep them to you. I think that it should come naturally to you, and that way when you do it, it'll be a lot more effective and a lot more funny. Other than that, just don't worry about it. I don't think podcasters expect every guest to be super funny and super entertaining. I think they want to have, first of all, a good conversation. And a good conversation doesn't have to be extremely funny to be a quality conversation. So don't worry about it. Don't put too much stress on being funny. If it's not working, just skip it. Stick to the conversation, stories, and everything that you're going to cover in the next tip. Tip number 5 in becoming the best podcast guest is actually a question that I've heard a lot on interviews when applying for a new job is, how are you different? Or why should we hire you? That's a little bit of an annoying question because you have to figure out why are you different from all the other people. And when you put 10,000 people in one place, you probably have a lot of things in common with a lot of people. But still, you should think of all the things that make you different from what other people are doing. You don't have to invent things, you don't have to lie about things. Just think of your perspectives that are your own. And people always always make a mistake here of thinking of something that's radically different than someone else's opinion. It doesn't have to be. You just have to stick to what you are doing differently and what you really believe in. And that will set you apart from a lot of people. I know that a lot of people are afraid to even say that, but that's kind of how I think about it. If you have something that you love or like or enjoy doing or have a specific way of thinking about it, say it. Even if it ripples out bad, I don't think the consequences will be too bad for you, because if you argumented well, you will always find some kind of opposing side that won't agree with you in anything that you say. So rather stick to the things that you love, that you like doing, and that will create an attraction to the audience that resonates with you. And one more thing here, I know this one's gonna make you struggle, but most people get stuck on this question because they think, oh, how am I different than other people? And think about what other people have that I don't have, or try to kind of distance themselves from other people and kind of create a gap. Rather than doing that, try thinking of what do I already have, and forget about other people. Just focus on what you do, what you have, what you love, and that's some kind of thing. That's the easiest way to find out who you are and what you're doing and what you have to say, and that will make it easier for you to contribute to the conversation in your own special way, because that's what's important for the audience. Number 6, first impressions matter. Let's face it, most people don't have the time to listen to a whole Joe Rogan podcast all the way to the whole 3 hours, but they would listen to like half an hour. So when you're talking about things, don't save your best topics for the end of the podcast or for another time when somebody might ask you. If there's a topic that you want to discuss at the start, try to go to it immediately, or try to hint towards it so that people know that something like that is coming, so they know what to expect from the podcast. Don't try to be like very mysterious and hope for the interviewer to kind of pull it out of you. Also think about what are the first things that you're doing, saying, thinking, showing in the first few seconds. Sometimes that might shock the person, sometimes that might intrigue the person, sometimes it's just the visuals, but a lot of people make their lasting memory out of the first few, even seconds, not just even minutes. But have you ever watched an episode of something and in the first few seconds were like, I don't like this, and you switched over to something else? So try to attract some attention while you're doing it. Also, I always like to think here of, if somebody is investing their time and effort into watching you, really try to convey a good message rather than just any message. And if you're doing some branding, try to do it for your brand, not for something else, so people remember you by what you want to stand. So those are the impressions that kind of stick with people, and they're formed in the first few minutes. A psychologist says that, and a lot of people in sales and recruitment and marketing know that you only have a limited amount of time time to convey a really, really good message and to impress somebody or to make somebody like you or to intrigue someone, you know. So try to be fast with it rather than slow. I know that it won't be easy a lot of the times because sometimes podcasters do a long intro and things like that. If you want to create a better intro for your podcast interviewer, maybe give him a few really, really good tips about what you did already, what you achieved, and what are the most interesting things about you, so they can say it in the intro, so that he or she who's leading the podcast already intrigues the audience, and that way the audience gets a sample of who you are and what you're going to talk about, and then they already know, they already did the first part for you, so they kind of handled half of the first impression for you. If they do a good job in that, they're going to buy you some more time, I'm sure about that. Number 7 is the golden tip, and it's people want to hear a story. I often get the question of like, oh, what should I talk about in a podcast, you know? Or people tell me, oh, I don't want to be a podcast guest, I don't know what to talk about. Well, you lived 30 years of your life, you have 30 years of topics to talk about, and you already have a lot of ideas in your head. You just don't know how to structure or prioritize them. But one tip that's basically the most interesting in any podcast that you're listening to is basically a story. People want to hear stories. People want to hear the narrative about something. If I just made this podcast and told you fact after fact after fact, like first impression lasts 7 seconds, and if you don't do it in that, you won't be able to achieve connection with someone. No, you want to hear a story about how somebody connected with someone in 7 seconds, and that lasted for a longer time. When you're doing a podcast, try to tell a story where people are captivated by everything that's happening in it. And every great stand-up comedian, every great public speaker, every motivational speaker, every author knows how to create a rich story. Add a lot of details in it. The last great story that I heard, and this is a great example, is Mr. Beast. I don't know if you know Jimmy Donaldson, but he's a really, really strong YouTuber that's growing really rapidly right now. Basically, he went on a bunch of podcasts, and on one of them with Logan Paul, he told the story of how he almost died.
Let me cook you. Story about the time I almost died.
Now, usually people ask Jimmy about how to grow their YouTube, but this was an exceptional opportunity where Jimmy told a story from his personal life where he almost died. Nobody got a story like that out of him. It was unique because of that. The podcast lasted for another hour, but Logan made the whole podcast, the whole thumbnail, title, and everything just about that one little piece of the whole podcast about how Jimmy almost died. It's a great episode. You should definitely watch it because Jimmy and him became friends, and it's really interesting to see how their relationship evolves. And Jimmy is a great content creator. I would love to have him on the Young to Go podcast one day. Jimmy, if you're watching, give me a shout. But basically, people loved it because it was a story. Usually Jimmy talks about metrics of his YouTube channel and how to grow and how to increase watch time and things like that, and that's super valuable. But talking about podcasts in general, the one thing that will keep people hooked, the one thing that will keep people reading, listening, watching until the end is a great story. So try thinking of a few stories that you know that are really, really good and interesting, and if the interviewer on the podcast inspires you of a story or makes you think of a story, use that momentum to convey the emotion that you portrayed during that thing that happened to you while you were younger or whatever, right? Because you want to get the best out of you and convey the best to the audience. When you're thinking of how to narrow what you're going to talk about, if the topic of the podcast is structured and set in place, then try to narrow it down. Don't tell stories about cats if you're on a business podcast. Maybe it's not related, maybe somebody will find it cute, but usually people want value out of podcasts. Decide in advance what stories you should keep, what stories you should get rid of, and that will help you narrow it down and become a better podcast guest. If somebody asks you about something, don't answer just yes. That kind of drops the whole atmosphere. That unless it's an epic moment where the whole conversation stops just to hear your yes or no, which people sometimes do on podcasts with celebrities because they want to see if they want to kind of catch them off guard to get some intriguing information out of them. But usually in normal podcasts, you basically want the conversation going. You want to hear a story, you want to see how something finished, started, ended, and then a yes or no answer kind of makes the whole thing drop. So rather than saying yes to something, say, yes, I did this because of that, and that's how it evolved into this, and then that happened, and you basically continue a story from there. That gives the interviewer a lot more freedom to ask more questions. It engages the conversation in a nice way, and everybody gets some value out of it. Tip number 8 in becoming the best podcast guest ever is provide value. Now, you might have heard other podcasters, YouTubers, public speakers talk about that. The whole point of listening to a podcast is getting some value out of it. I know that you're probably sometimes listening to podcasts that don't have any business or financial value behind them, but you might listen to podcasts just because you need the conversation, so that's a value for you. So try to make the conversation more interesting. If you're on a podcast where money is discussed, try to describe how you did it, not just how much you made. Because when I'm listening to a podcast, I want to know how a person did something. That gives me value, because then I can implement all the steps that the person implemented themselves. That way I'm learning, that way I'm implementing as well the other day, because I go, this person did this, that gives me steps on how I can improve my life, and that drives me forward. If you're on a funny podcast where people want to hear funny stories, then tell your best funny stories, because that's the value that you're there for. You're providing interesting and funny content to the audience. You basically want to figure out what value is for you, for the podcast, for the listeners, for everybody watching on all social media, and then you want to focus on that as much as you can. Basically, Joe Rogan wants interesting stories. If you go there, if you talk about your cat, it probably won't be that interesting, unless you're like a really serious catrepreneur, like talking about it like it's the end of the world for you. I'm getting off track here a little bit, but I want to emphasize that you should focus on the things that provide value to the audience. Now, you might not know what it is for you, or you might not know what that is for the podcast, but that's why I said in tip number 2 to research the podcast, to see who the audience is. Sometimes you get a lot of information out of the comments below the podcast, and there you see what the audience is thinking about, what they're asking. Maybe a previous guest didn't finish a story about something, and then you see, people were interested about that. That might have been a very interesting story if you told it or finished it. That might also get you invited a second time to a podcast, but basically you want to say everything that you have to say in the hour that you usually have. Some podcasts are even shorter, guys, so aim for the most valuable things that you're going to say in the least amount of time. Tip number 9 to be the best podcast guest ever is the one that you hear from everybody. It's, just relax. Well, it's not just relax. It's not that easy sometimes. When you're super tense, you're basically having a tough time saying anything, and you're kind of stuck in your own zone and you can't get out of it, and it's a special mental place that's kind of keeping you but be yourself. That's a lot better advice than just relax, because if you could have just relaxed, you wouldn't have needed that advice. That's a little bit contradictory there, but most people say it because they don't know what to tell you otherwise. If you're being yourself, then nothing's blocking you. You are not being yourself. You're creating a mental image of something that's blocking you, and you're basically blocking yourself from being you. That's the problem that creates on tip number 9. So try to forget about what you're not and what you might mess up. Try to focus on who you are. Again, it's similar to the previous tip that I gave on what to talk about or what to think about, but I really think that the most important thing is to nail the things that you're really, really good at. So if you're training dogs, for example, and you're really good at it, talk about that. That's you. Why would you be afraid of talking about that? If you love dogs, if you're training them for the last few years, you're basically an expert on that. Talk about that. People are going to appreciate you talking about dogs. They might love it. You might find other people who are looking for a dog trainer like yourself. You might find other dog enthusiasts that are gonna talk with you on social media all day about dogs, because, hey, they love them too, So if you're putting barriers on yourself, if you're not relaxed, if you're really tense, that's just outside pressure. Always go back to, who am I? Why am I here? And that's where you'll get your answer, and it'll make it a lot easier for you to answer the questions that the interviewer is asking you. Because the interviewer doesn't want you to be tense. They basically want you to be as relaxed as possible, right? Think about it. If you're the interviewer and people come over to your podcast, do you want them to be tense? Do you want them to be like stuck up and not talk about it? No, they have your best interest in mind, because the better you are at speaking about something, the better their podcast will be. So You have to relax, not just for yourself, but also for them. And it might be a good idea to tell the interviewer that you are tense, that you can't relax. You would be surprised how much that helps, because sometimes people will literally tell you the thing that helped them or the thing that's appropriate for that situation. Sometimes you're in front of cameras, blah, 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 and they will tell you like, look, man, this podcast is not live, so if you say something wrong, we'll just cut it out in the edits afterwards, you know? And then you might think, oh, right, we can cut everything out that I don't want in the podcast, right? That will be amazing, because then you won't have to be under so much pressure. Sometimes it's also really, really easy just to have a longer chat before you start the podcast. I always love doing that. I usually record my podcasts online, and then I invite people like 10 to 15 minutes before the pre-scheduled time to the meeting, and then something interesting happens. I usually notice that in the first 15 minutes of every podcast, all of my guests are a little bit stuck up. They answer with shorter questions and they don't tell a lot of stories. Everything that I told you earlier that shouldn't be done that way, right? And I noticed that, and I was like, why does that happen? And I listened to the podcast, I was like, oh, the second half sounds better. And then I realized, they relax, they just need more time. So a lot of the people weren't used to cameras, a lot of people were under stress, weren't used to recording stuff online, weren't used to being on podcasts. But after like 45 minutes, they relax into it because they forget about the camera, they forget about the lights, they forget about the social media world watching them, and they just start focusing on this podcast, and they start focusing on my questions, they start focusing on what I'm saying, and then they relax. They're just like, oh yeah, I'm having a conversation with Borna, now it feels great. So I was thinking like, all right, I'm just gonna start the podcast earlier, let them talk for more, and then start recording later. And that's exactly what I did. After a while, all my guests got a lot more relaxed. Just because they got into talking earlier, they relaxed a lot sooner, and it's basically the more time that I gave them before the podcast, the easier it was for them. It's amazing. Definitely try that. I suggest also doing some practice podcasts before. If it's your first time doing a podcast, try doing one with a friend or family member, or just in front of a mirror where you imagine somebody asking you questions and then you answer them and go back and forth just as a practice round. That should work wonders for you guys. And yeah, let's go to tip number 10. Tip number 10 for being the best podcast guest ever is basically the end of the podcast. People usually ask you for some finishing thoughts. There you have an opportunity to thank the audience, thank the interviewer for inviting you. Always be nice, always try to kind of accumulate this positive karma. At the end, usually people ask you, where do you want the audience to find out more about you, your socials, or whatever you're using, right? I noticed that a lot of people make a big mistake there at the end where they go like, oh, you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, LinkedIn, and then they start counting off 50 social media and their books and their websites and their products and their everything. And then for 3 minutes, you're just listening to an ad. And I'm like, all right, this could have been done differently. Don't beg. Don't overdo it. Don't be greedy and be like, oh yeah, follow me. You know, you don't want to convey that you're there just to grab the audience from the other person. You basically want to tell them where they can go and why they should go there. I'll give you an example. For instance, if you're on a business podcast, you basically want to talk about business-related topics, and then somebody will ask you, oh, well, can people follow your work more? I would go for something like LinkedIn because that's a more business-oriented platform. Mention that you have other platforms. I would do it like, you can follow me on most social media out there, but I'm spending most of my time on LinkedIn right now. And then give them a why they should follow you there. Because there I post content about what my company is doing. And then they're like, aha, I have to go to LinkedIn because I know that he will post stuff about this. And that gives them a where and why, not just this and this and this and that, because that the first version is just advertising, right? But if you tell them where you are and why you're doing something, why they should follow you, then more people will come over and follow you on, let's say, LinkedIn. If you're on a more relaxed podcast, maybe LinkedIn isn't the best option, but if that's the only one that you're using, say it. You might always find someone who creates a new social profile because of you. just don't overdo it. I think that's always a hard sell at the end and always kind of leaves it a little bit, like needy and greedy. And I don't like when people are putting too much emphasis on, oh yeah, come and join, like they desperately need it. I feel that if you've done a good job in the podcast, people will automatically go online and research you, and that's how you will gain the most subscribers, followers, whatever, right? Just don't overdo it with the social media, guys. And tip 11 that I saved for the last, which is our bonus tip on how to become the best podcast guest ever, is basically, it'll be okay. It'll be okay, guys. If this is your first time doing a podcast, if you don't know how to do this, if somebody invited you just to see how you would perform as a guest, I'd say don't worry about it too much. If it's not the biggest podcast in the world, you probably won't mess it up a lot. You can gain more than you can lose, and if you don't say something radical, you'll probably be fine. Even if you don't pronounce something wrong, if you say some words wrong, people might even connect to you just because of that. People might remember you just because of that. My English is not perfect, but I'm not afraid to go somewhere and stumble around my words and say something wrong. I know that people forgive that. In the business world, there are so many companies that employ people that don't have the perfect English, for example, but they're good workers, so you're not gonna hate the person because they don't have the perfect language, right? Even if you don't talk about the most interesting topics, even if you don't nail the story as you wanted it and planned it, don't worry about it, guys. If it's your first podcast, look at some of the first podcasts that other people did. Look at their work after 1 year, and you can see how big of an improvement they've made. You can see how big of a jump they've made. This is just like the gym, just like practicing any sport. It takes time, it takes practice. If it's your first time, don't put too much pressure upon yourself. Think about it as a great learning experience and a great, maybe even networking experience. Go to a podcast, you love meeting new people, people will reach out to you. Even if nothing happens, even if nobody reaches out for you, you can say that you learned something. You can always take the experience that you had and be like, all right, I was on a podcast, I did this, I learned that, this was good, this was bad, this was wrong, this was really good, this was really bad, I should improve on this. And you kind of get a list of self-evaluating yourself, and then you can build from there. You can decide, yeah, I really like doing these podcast things, they seem fun, I meet people, I record it, you have it recorded online, you can watch it wherever in the future, and you can also decide that you don't like it and then quit and never do a podcast again. It's your choice, right? You can do whatever you want, but it will be a great learning experience for you guys, and I really think that it's a great thing to do. And I feel that there's a lot of value in podcasts because now the world is kind of moving to a place where you want to save time, right? You want to do two things at the same time. You want to clean your dishes and listen to a podcast because that way you save time, right? Or you want to go for a walk or a run outside and listen to something useful while you're training your body or also training your mind. That's how I approach it. So if somebody doesn't do a good job, I don't look bad at the person. I don't leave a bad comment saying like, oh, you suck. No. I sometimes even do the opposite. I encourage the person somewhat. I'm like, this is a good guest. They have some very good points. And I always hope that the person who was there, who didn't do a good job, would see the comment and get some encouragement. I know that especially when you're starting a podcast, everything feels so slow. Everything is not going as you planned. The guests are not the best. Your questions are not the best. Your sentences are not formulated the best. Sometimes you're just in a situation like that. You can't do professional marathon level sprints or compete at the Olympics or be a world champion in boxing from doing it just once. You have to do it over and over again. You have to get practice. You have to be good at it. Then you have to be great at it. Then you have to be exceptional at it. And all of that takes time, guys. All of it takes time. All of it takes effort. All of it takes repetition. So don't worry about it. It'll be fine. It'll be okay. You probably won't mess up as much as some celebrities on some shows did, or cause a controversy or cause some conflict there, or you probably won't. Just have a normal conversation with people and it'll be fine. And don't put too much pressure on you guys. It'll be okay. It'll be great. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you in the next episode with Coffee and Tea with Borna Z. And make sure to watch the other episodes of the Uncle Go podcast. Bye-bye.
The Uncle Go Podcast.